Hello, and welcome to the Chip Observer. The podcast where we look beyond buzzwords and try to navigate the ins and the outs of the semiconductor industry and explore how technology is evolving and transforming our daily lives. As always, we are presented by Tech Insights, the definitive source of semiconductor analysis, with continued focus on growth and providing value to the industry. And as always, to get the most out of this podcast, we suggest you subscribe and follow to get the latest news and updates. So for this episode, we're looking back to our sister monthly publication, the Chip Observer online magazine, that was published just last week, March 5th, available now online via the Tech Insights website and platform. We're hoping to provide a quick recap on recent hot topics. Luckily, having access to the primary authors for this month's issue available in-house, we have with us David McQueen and Dylan McGrath. We're looking at our favorite subjects. Let's start off with artificial intelligence. And as previously published and mentioned, we've got France and Saudi Arabia, which are expanding on AI investments. And then, of course, Apple committing $500 billion to data centers. So, one, what's your take on how this will shape global AI landscape, guys?
Yeah, okay. I think the first thing to say is one of the things that we looked at with regard to these announcements was how much was actually incremental investment from what had not been previously announced. And that was not completely straightforward. Clearly, at least some of this was incremental investment, but not all. Either way, I mean, I think they clearly show that the U.S. wants to maintain its leadership in AI and that other nations, in this case, France and Saudi Arabia, but they're not alone, are keen to attract and build an AI ecosystem. And, I think they all recognize that AI is and will be big business and strategically important.
Yeah. I mean, if we look at the US specifically, so obviously we've got the money that you've mentioned there from Apple going into their data centers. And I think, some people have been characterizing them as Apple as being a bit behind in terms of AI. I mean, certainly if you look at their, the A chips and M series chips that are in their phones and laptops, tablets as well, of course, you've got actually quite, powerful NPU cores there, equivalent to the best that, AMD and Intel and so on are coming out with. But they don't really quite have the services yet to back them up. But, I don't know, to a certain extent, do consumers necessarily care about that when you've got, the ability to run virtually any app you want on your iPhone anyway? I've got Apple devices and I'm using Gemini, I'm using Copilot, I'm trying out lots of different services just now myself. So, and Apple's got the hardware there to help me do it. I think people have been a bit down on Apple saying they're a bit slow, but, I think they'll get there. This is big money. It's going to be, a couple of years probably before these things are all built out. It's a big investment there. But I think maybe if we, focus a bit on what the states, by that I mean nation states, are doing. So we had Starlink that was announced by the US government a month or two ago.
Stargate.
Yeah. Stargate, sorry.
Right.
Yes. And, a lot of that seemed to be existing money, just kind of repackaged. Oracle had already announced 5 data centers and that the money for that formed part of that. The French one, I think there seems to be kind of mostly new money, but the Saudi Arabia investment in particular for Project Transcendence. Now, that actually happened around about 3 months ago, that announcement. But I mean, the first really big tranche of that spending came just this month, which was 1.5 billion to Grok to build a data center in Saudi Arabia. So that's the first big spend of that. And that investment fund, that's all new money as far as I can tell. And, one of the key things that I think was quite interesting is that is going towards building an Arabic language AI model, which is something that, up to now, everything's been very much based in English. The data that you're collecting from, everything from, newspapers and social feeds and all sorts of other things, predominantly that's in English as well. So there's a kind of cultural bias in all of these existing models already because of the data set that they're collecting from, and then a kind of lack of usability for people in other countries as well.
Right, so basically you're seeing a switch in trend and direction when it comes to language models, and almost a cultural shift as well because of an Arabic language model being developed.
Yeah, and I think that, to a certain extent, that's true of the French investments as well. That culturally, the US and France, there's differences there, and obviously a different language as well. So again, it's creating these models where you've seen this big uptake in the US and other English speaking countries, but are you seeing that necessarily at the same level elsewhere in the world? And I think these investments will push that forward.
Right. So talking on shifts in trends, let's look at semiconductor advancements like Intel's 18A process and Samsung's YMTC NAND licensing, and of course, there's also quantum breakthroughs with qubits redefining industry standards. What's your idea on how they might be able to compete and possibly complement in scalability and applications?
Yeah, I mean, Intel, that was yet another vote of confidence. I think in the January issue of Chip Observer, we'd covered them actually showing the devices, Panther Lake, isn't it? On running on laptops at CES. So and those are going to be manufactured on the 18A node. And then this latest announcement of it being its availability to external customers, it's not really a kind of new piece of news, if you like, but it's important because it does demonstrate that Intel is on schedule. That was planned to happen in the first half of this year. It has happened actually in the first quarter of this year. So they seem to be very much on track for that, which I think makes life very interesting for TSMC.
Right.
That they have a cutting edge competitor and a competitor that's getting to market, in fact, slightly ahead of their equivalent process. So that's an interesting one. And maybe actually if we talk a bit more about TSMC, because looking at these big funds for AI, of course, just after Chip Observer was published, TSMC came out really with another big fund as well, or a large tranche of investment. So they had already committed, I think, to spending $65 billion and the Arizona facility that they're building out. And unfortunately, just after Chip Observer, so we didn't have a chance to comment it in print, if you like. But yeah, an extra $100 billion for
Now is your time to comment on it. Oddly,
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, Dylan, do you have from an analyst perspective, do you have really any comments on what TSMC is saying and doing really with a shift in this trend?
Yeah, well, excuse me. Yes. So similarly, a lot of this investment was, if not announced, kind of planned. I mean, they had the land existing, but the commitment of $100 billion, an additional $100 billion on top of the $65 billion that they had already committed to spending in the US is obviously very significant. And it does, I think, tie in. I mean, there's so many reasons why this is happening. And, we can't ignore the geopolitical things going on in the world. And obviously, the United States is very keen on making sure that TSMC has more of a presence here. And I think, it's very much a mutual thing, right? Especially with the uncertainty over tariffs and all the other things going on right now, it makes sense for TSMC to have a larger presence here in the US. And I would add to that, in discussion of the AI, obviously this is not, this is for building chips, and these aren't all AI chips, but I think that increasingly there is an AI component, an NPU or an AI accelerator on more and more chips, and certainly more and more advanced chips, which is what we assume TSMC is going to be building there. And so at a certain point, it's hard to differentiate. It's hard to draw a clear line and say, well, this is AI investment and this is not. I mean, you can kind of put it into the same bucket as the AI announcement that the US announced earlier this year. This is more investment in the infrastructure to make this happen.
So I've got a quick off the record question for either one of you. Feel free to ignore it or answer it if possible. Do you think this is just a show? Throwing all
Well,
of this money or advising that they're, announcing that they're throwing all of this money out there. It's just a keep up. Is it just a show, or are they really planning on investing this kind of fund into these projects?
so I would say I do. I mean, I do think it is a show, regardless of whether it is real or whether it actually happens or not. I mean, there's a political reason why they decided to make this big announcement, right? And it's
Right.
it's to curry favor with the administration or score political points. But I also do think that they are, and specifically in the case of TSMC, I do think that that is their plan. Um, David and I were talking earlier about these. Sometimes these plans don't come to fruition, um, but I think at this point that's certainly what they intend to do.
Yeah, no, we've seen, Intel delayed their fab investment, well, one of their fab investments a little bit. So, well, a little bit, 3 years. So quite significantly, it's kind of in limbo. But I think in this specific case with TSMC, I think they are going to follow through on that this is, real genuine new money. We're going to see those fabs being built. I think there's other questions around that. What process nodes are those fabs going to use? Is it going to be, even if it's the cutting edge today, by the time those fabs are built, 3 years time and plus, and then come online, even if they're using, TSMC's 2 nanometer node, which is their upcoming node that isn't even launched yet, that's going to compete with that Intel 18A, 3 years time, that's not going to be a cutting edge node anymore. So yeah,
Right.
exactly what that investment means, I think there's still a little bit of question marks over that. And then we also had TSMC saying that this is not political. Well, by having a press conference with the president, you've kind of inherently made it political, even if that wasn't, even if it's a commercial driving, factor behind it, you've kind of made that political by getting up on stage with the president.
Exactly. So regardless of what's being said and what's being promised right now, we really won't know for, at the very least, a short while over the next few months and possibly years.
Yeah. Yeah.
We are still waiting for the Foxconn facility in Wisconsin that was announced during the first Trump administration to break ground. And I'm joking about that because I mean they have said it actually isn't happening at all.
Right.
But
Right. No, that's understandable. Sticking to technology trends and changes, of course, we had announcements and details regarding Apple and iPhone prices, suppliers, and changes being done. So, for example, Apple's 5G modem shift. How do you think this is going to shift in the iPhone 16e? And of course, there's things like BOE surpassing Samsung and LG. In OLED supply, how is it going to affect Qualcomm, and then basically just the modem market and long-term supply chain strategy? What's your take on what's going on there?
Gonna go first, Dylan, or
sure, I'll jump
I
in.
feel like I'm hogging things.
Well, I was actually very surprised about the modem announcement, and I do think that this will pose issues for Qualcomm. I know that Apple, and they have a history of doing this cutting out their suppliers by making their own parts and thus needing fewer suppliers. It makes all the sense in the world if you can do it. So I do think that will have a rather significant impact. I mean, obviously, Apple products are huge volume. And so even a company the size of Qualcomm, I mean, that hurts.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think it's been rumored for at least 2 or 3 years that, Apple's been working on its own modem. So what we're seeing in this instance is going into that specific model only. But so Qualcomm isn't being wholly displaced just yet. But I think Apple's long-term ambition is clearly to have that modem across its entire range.
Sure.
Or, subsequent versions of those modems across its entire range. So ultimately, this will hit Qualcomm pretty hard, I think. And one of the other pieces that we covered in this month's Chip Observer was Skyworks getting a new CEO and having a very tough first day in the job. because they also announced that they'd lost Apple as a customer, and that led to a big share price tumble at that company. It's not going to have the same immediate impact on Qualcomm, but longer term it is. And to some extent, this even ties in with the TSMC announcement as well, because TSMC's first fab in the US in Arizona, its first customer there was Apple to create the A series chips. I forget exactly which number. I think it might have been A14. So I can see these, modems being produced in the US as well. So again, it's that supply chain reshuffle led by geopolitics, where you want to have that local source, going straight into your devices.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. And you mentioned reshuffling, and I think that's one of the key words out there. We've seen also recently new leadership and mergers with the corporate reshuffle, AI and electrifications within the automotive industry, and of course workforce changes. So how is this affecting automotive semiconductors, and what strategies are companies adopting to sort of stay competitive in their field?
Yeah, I think, that again, this is kind of, trying not to bring it back to politics all the time, but
Always, yeah, yeah.
it's kind of part and parcel of it. There's been, EV vehicle uptake hasn't been quite as strong as, perhaps was predicted. And part of that is down to tariffs. The US and the EU and other countries as well have put high tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. And, the Chinese auto OEMs are generally producing cheaper EVs than many Western companies are. So there's a reluctance in consumer uptake because EVs are quite expensive. The cheaper EVs that are coming out of China with a 100% tariff in many regions, they're not so cost effective anymore. And in the US as well, again, going back to politics a little bit, this administration has not been a fan of renewable energy, and so has eliminated the incentives that consumers had for buying EVs as well. And of course, in an EV, you've got a lot more, semiconductor content than you would do in a typical internal combustion engine vehicle. So that's having a pretty negative impact, and we're seeing, on semi microchip, cutting back their workforce, and yeah, broadly, we're pretty much expecting a fairly tough year for companies that are supplying the automotive sector.
Right, right. Dylan, do you have any comments on that specifically? Of course, in general, just tariffs is become everyone's second favorite subject these days, and of course the ongoing CHIPS Act uncertainties. What do you have to say about that?
Well, just commenting on the corporate reshuffling and what's going on with EVs, I do think that as David mentioned, the reduction of incentives to acquire EVs, and as well as there is, specifically in the US, there has been slower uptake than people thought. And I do believe that in the long term that this could cause a problem for not only US auto suppliers, but their suppliers as well, because if they stop focusing on electric vehicles because of the lack the removal of those incentives, as well as the fact that consumers haven't been as interested so far, I just think in the long term, that just gives the rest of the world to these Chinese automakers, because I think that we can all agree that I don't know how long it will take, but in the long term, people will be driving electric vehicles, and if the U.S. suppliers aren't making them here, they're gonna have a problem, I think.
Right.
And so same goes for their suppliers. You know, they won't be buying those chips.
Right, exactly. So a lot of this, not only politically, but also just at the financial level, a lot of this is pushing that reshoring effort, basically.
Yeah, and I think really, again, with the US automakers, if they have less incentive to build these vehicles, they're not gonna be able to, their vehicles will one day they're gonna need to sell those in other parts of the world where they also do business.
That's
I believe.
exactly right. Yep, that seems to be the common thread across all subjects regarding this right now. Perfect. David, do you have anything else you'd like to mention?
No, not really. Not on that topic. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah. Are we
Well,
are we done for now?
I thank you. I thank you both
Yeah.
very much. Yeah. Well, there you have it. Whether we're focused on AI, global investments, or the potential political influences on the semiconductor industry, know that our experts are always ready to provide both detailed and insightful counsel. We'd like to thank our guests David McQueen and Dylan McGrath for sharing their time and insights. Note that the contents discussed here today were for informational purposes only and don't reflect views or opinions of the institutions or organizations mentioned. The monthly published magazine with all of these details and more is currently available via our website and platform. As always, to get the most out of this podcast, please subscribe and follow to get the latest news and updates. And for more semiconductor details with a snapshot on the industry, we invite you to visit us online at techinsights.com and sign up for free to become a guest user. There you'll gain access to our platform with complimentary reports, analysis, specialists, and industry-related news. We'll catch you next time with more observations and insights, where every listen brings us closer to the stories that matter. Until then, stay curious, stay connected, and stay insightful.